She was 8 years old, standing barefoot on a frozen kitchen floor, holding a baby who hadn't stopped crying in 6 hours. The apartment was empty, the heat was off, and somewhere outside in the gray January dark, her mother had simply stopped coming back. Lily Harper didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked down at her baby brother's face, red and trembling, and made a promise that no child should ever have to make. I will keep you alive. What happened next? The wagon, the winter streets, the closed doors, and the scarred man watching from the shadows would change the lives of everyone on Elm Street forever. If you've ever believed that the most dangerous-looking person in the room might also be the only one willing to save you, stay until the end. This story is for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, and let's begin. The cold came in through the gap under the front door, a slow, thin whisper of January air that crept across the linoleum and found the children before anything else did. Lily Harper felt it first against her bare feet when she climbed down from the bed she shared with her brother, that particular 5 a.m. cold that has no mercy and no interest in who it hurts. She stood still for a moment in the dark, listening. The apartment made sounds at night. The pipes groaned, the upstairs neighbor walked heavy, cars moved on the street outside with a wet hiss against the slick asphalt. She knew all those sounds the way a child knows the sounds of survival. She cataloged them the way other 8-year-olds cataloged cartoon characters or spelling words, but the sound she was listening for wasn't there. Her mother's breathing, the small shuffle of her feet, the creak of the third floorboard near the bathroom door that always gave her away when she tried to sneak out before Lily woke. Nothing. Lily padded to the bedroom doorway and looked down the short hall. The bathroom door was open. The kitchen beyond it was dark. She walked the whole length of the apartment in under 20 seconds. It wasn't a large space, and stood in the center of the kitchen and understood, with a quiet that was worse than any noise, that her mother was not here. The clock on the microwave said 5:14. It had been blinking the wrong time for 3 weeks because the power had flickered during a storm and no one had reset it, so Lily knew it was really somewhere around 3 a.m., or maybe 4. Outside the single kitchen window, the sky was the color of a bruise, deep purple-black at the edges, the streetlights making small orange halos in the freezing mist. She checked the counter first. Sometimes her mother left a note. There was no note. She checked the table, a cereal bowl with dried milk at the bottom, a spoon, a folded electricity notice they couldn't pay, and 3 quarters and 2 dimes arranged in a small pile near the edge like her mother had been counting them. 65 cents. That was what was on the table. That was what there was. Lily stood there and breathed through her nose the way she'd taught herself to do when the thing living behind her sternum, the panic, the squeeze, the hot pressure that threatened to climb her throat, started to wake up. In through the nose, slow. Hold it. Out through the mouth, slower. The panic did not go away, but it went back down, and that was enough. Behind her from the bedroom, Ben started to cry. Benjamin Harper was 14 months old and had been born into the same apartment and the same shortage that Lily had been navigating her entire life. He had their mother's dark eyes and their father's stubborn jaw, and he cried with his whole body, the kind of infant urgency that made it physically impossible for Lily to stay still. She was back down the hall before the second cry finished, lifting him out of the crib that was wedged between the wall and the foot of the bed, pressing him against her chest and feeling his small fingers grasp immediately at the fabric of her pajama top. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey, I got you." He cried anyway. He was cold and hungry and 14 months old, and reasons didn't matter to him yet. What mattered was the warmth of her and the sound of her voice, and she gave him both while she tried to think. She carried him to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There was half a carton of milk, an end piece of bread in a bag, 3 eggs, a container of leftover rice that might have been 3 days old, and a plastic bottle of ketchup. She stood looking at this inventory the way a general looks at a map of a losing battle. She scrambled the eggs. She warmed the rice in the microwave. She tore the bread into pieces small enough for Ben's 10 teeth to manage, and made him a plate with the egg in the middle and the rice around the sides and the bread arranged in a circle at the edge. Because when she made his food look like something, a sun, a face, a pattern, he ate better and cried less. Tonight she made it look like a wheel, a wagon wheel. She didn't know why that image came to her, but it did. He ate. She gave him the last of the milk in his sippy cup and watched him drink it with the focused seriousness that babies bring to the act of eating. And for a few minutes the kitchen was almost okay. The overhead light was harsh and yellow, and one of the bulbs had burned out, so it flickered sometimes. But the scrambled eggs smelled like food, and Ben was eating, and the morning was still on the other side of the window where it couldn't find them yet. Lily ate the 3 remaining crackers from a sleeve she found in the back of the cabinet and told herself she wasn't hungry, which was a lie she had become very good at. She waited until 7, then 8. She put Ben in the playpen in the living room with his blocks and his one stuffed bear, a faded brown thing missing one eye that he dragged everywhere, and she went door to door on their floor. Mrs. Okafor in 3B had 4 grandchildren and usually had food. She cracked the door 2 inches, chain still on, and looked at Lily with eyes that were sorry before her mouth said anything. "Baby, I can't. My daughter is coming today, and I've barely enough as it is." A pause. "Is your mama home?" "She went out early," Lily said. "She'll be back soon." She had already decided she would say that. It wasn't exactly a lie. She believed it. She needed to believe it. Mrs. Okafor's eyes stayed sorry. The door closed. Mr. Petrikis in 3A was a retired man who smelled of cigarette smoke and sometimes gave Lily wrapped candy from a dish by his door. He listened to her knock, waited a long time, and never answered. She could hear the television inside. She could hear his chair creak when he shifted his weight. She stood outside his door and listened to him decide not to open it, and something in the region of her chest went a little colder. The apartment at the end of the hall, 3D, had a new family, young couple. They opened the door together, standing side by side, and looked at her with the particular wariness of people who are not yet sure what the neighborhood is. She asked if they had any bread or a can of soup she could borrow and pay back when her mama got home. The woman started to say something that sounded like yes. The man touched her arm, and she stopped, and they looked at each other, and then the man said, "Sorry, we can't help," and closed the door with a finality that had no apology in it at all. Lily walked back to her apartment. She picked up Ben. She sat on the floor in the living room with him in her lap and looked at the wall for a long time. She thought about calling someone. There were people you were supposed to call. She knew that. But she also knew what happened when those calls got made, because it had happened once before, when she was 5 and her mother had gone through a bad stretch, and a neighbor had called and a woman with a clipboard had come and had talked to Lily in a voice that was kind but mechanical, like kindness was a setting on a machine. And for 3 weeks, Lily had lived in a house with a woman named Carolyn who was not unkind but was not her mother. And there had been other children there, and one of them had taken the stuffed bear and bent one of the eyes until it popped off. And when Lily had cried about it, the Carolyn woman had said these things happen, honey, in that same mechanical kindness voice. She was not calling anyone. She went to the closet where the junk accumulated, the things you mean to throw out but never do, and found what she was looking for in under a minute because she had seen it there 100 times. A red wagon, the old-fashioned kind with a wooden handle and metal sides, the paint chipped off in long strips revealing the gray underneath, the wheels slightly uneven so it always pulled a little to the right. It had been her father's, or that's what her mother said. He'd left it behind with his other things when he went, which was when Lily was 4 and too young to understand what went meant, except that it meant absence, and absence was the shape of him now. She tied a length of rope she found in the same closet to the handle to make it longer so she could pull it without having to hunch. She dressed Ben in his warmest things, the thick onesie, the fleece pants, the knit hat with the bear ears that someone had given them at a church donation drive 2 winters ago. She dressed herself in her heaviest coat, the one with the busted zipper she held closed with a safety pin, and her boots that had a crack in the left sole she'd been covering with a piece of cardboard she replaced every few days. She found the 3 quarters and 2 dimes from the kitchen table and put them in her coat pocket. She put Ben in the wagon on top of a folded blanket, tucked the stuffed bear next to him, and walked out into the January morning. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. It was the kind of cold that doesn't just take your warmth. It takes something more fundamental, something under the skin, like it's reaching for whatever keeps you from giving up. The sky was low and white-gray, the color of old ashes, and the street was glazed with a thin skin of ice that hadn't been salted. Lily's boots found the sure patches on instinct. She pulled the wagon, and Ben rode it with the focused attention of a toddler encountering wind for the first time, his mittened hands gripping the sides, his one-eyed bear jammed in the crook of his elbow. She knocked on doors for 3 hours. Not apartment doors this time. Doors on the surrounding streets, the small houses and the row homes, the businesses just opening, the diner on Clement that had the sign in the window about no soliciting that she read and kept knocking anyway because the word soliciting was one she didn't know and she was too cold for vocabulary. The woman inside looked at her through the glass and pointed at the sign, and Lily pointed at Ben, and the woman looked away. A man at a house on Grove told her to try the shelter on 5th. She nodded like she would. She'd been to that shelter once with her mother, and the smell of it was in her memory. Ammonia and boiled food, and something underneath both that she had no name for, something that smelled like the end of options. And she pulled the wagon back to the sidewalk and kept going in a different direction. A woman on Maple came close to saying yes. She looked at Ben a long time with an expression that suggested she had once had a small child of her own or had wanted one. Her hand was on the door, and she was on the edge of something. Lily could feel it, the way you can feel a conversation tipping toward what you need. And then a man's voice called from inside, "Who is it, Donna?" And something went out of the woman's face, and she said, "Nothing, honey," and closed the door softly, like she was apologetic about it, which somehow made it worse. At the corner of Elm and 3rd, next to a barber shop that hadn't opened yet, there was a bench. Lily sat on it and pulled Ben's wagon next to her and looked at the street and tried to calculate what she had in her pocket against what she needed and understood that the arithmetic was impossible. 75 cents. She had 75 cents and a brother who would be hungry again in 2 hours, and a mother who had been gone since sometime in the night, and a coat with a safety pin zipper and boots that let the cold through the left sole, like the cold had figured out the same weakness the cardboard was trying to hide. She did not cry. She put her hand in her pocket and closed her fingers around the coins and felt their weight and breathed through her nose. That was when she felt it. The particular quality of being watched. Not the casual glance of a passing stranger. Something heavier than that. The focused, deliberate attention of someone who has stopped moving specifically because of you. Lily had grown up in spaces where she had to know the difference, and she knew it now, in the skin at the back of her neck, in some animal part of her that understood attention as a category of danger. She turned slowly. Across the street, parked at the curb in front of a hardware store that was still shuttered for the morning, was a motorcycle. A big one, dark and heavy, the chrome catching the pale winter light in dull flashes. And beside it, standing with his back half against the store's brick wall, was a man. He was big. Not the gym-built kind of big, but the kind that comes from years of doing hard things, the kind that settles into a person's frame and stays. He wore a leather jacket that had been through weather and time, the kind of jacket that carries its own history in the crease patterns and the wear at the elbows. His arms were crossed, his boots were heavy on the sidewalk, planted like he'd grown there. She couldn't see his face clearly from across the street in the flat morning light, but she could see the tattoos on his hands and the gray in his close-cut hair and the stillness of him, the unnerving absolute stillness, the way only a certain kind of man can be still. A man who has learned that stillness is sometimes the only safe move left. He was looking at her. No, he was looking at Ben. And then his eyes came up to hers, and she felt the weight of them. And what she saw in that half second of eye contact across the frozen street was not what she expected. It was not threat. It was not hunger. It was not the sliding evaluation she'd seen in the eyes of bad men and had learned to recognize before she'd had words for it. What she saw was something that looked impossibly like pain. He looked away first. He uncrossed his arms, turned, and walked to the back of the hardware store without looking at her again, and disappeared around the corner like he'd never been there. Lily stayed on the bench. Her heart was moving too fast. She looked at Ben, who had fallen asleep against his bear with his hat half pushed over his nose, pink-cheeked and oblivious to everything. The cold, the hunger coming, the stranger, the absence at the center of their lives that had no shape yet, but already had weight. She looked at the corner where the man had gone. She waited. He didn't come back. But later, 20 minutes later, when the cold had finally forced her off the bench and she'd tucked the blanket tighter around Ben and picked up the wagon handle and started back toward the apartment because she had nowhere else to go and the math of the morning had come out the same way she knew it would. She passed the corner of Elm and 3rd again, and she stopped. On the bench where she had been sitting, there was a brown paper bag. She looked at it. She looked at the empty street. She looked at the corner around the hardware store, where there was no motorcycle, no man, nothing but a strip of old ice and a crushed paper cup rolling slowly against the curb in a gust of wind. She crossed to the bench and picked up the bag. Inside was a full sleeve of crackers, a jar of peanut butter, 2 juice boxes, a folded $10 bill, and at the very bottom, placed carefully, a small package of baby food, the kind in the pouch that Ben could eat without teeth, in the flavor she happened to know he preferred, which was apple and sweet potato, which he would have no way of knowing, which meant it might have been the only kind in the store, or it might have been a coincidence, or it might have been something else entirely, something she didn't have a category for yet. She stood on the sidewalk in the January cold holding the paper bag, and for the first time since she'd woken up on the frozen kitchen floor with the silence of her mother's absence ringing in her ears like a bell, for the first time since she'd done the math and made the promise and pulled the red wagon out into the white cold morning, the pressure behind her sternum shifted. Not gone. It was not gone. But something was different now. Something had changed in the geometry of the morning, and she couldn't name it, and she didn't trust it, and she pulled the wagon home with the bag balanced on Ben's lap, and her face set against the wind and her mind working at the same question from every angle it had. Who was he? What did he want? And why? After all the doors she'd knocked on, after every face that had decided she wasn't worth the risk of kindness, why was the only person who had given her anything the one who had looked most like someone she was supposed to fear? She didn't know the answer. She didn't know yet that the answer had a name. And she didn't know, couldn't know, not yet, standing on that sidewalk in the winter light, with her brother asleep in the red wagon and a stranger's $10 bill folded in her coat pocket, that the man who had given it to her was sitting 2 blocks away in the parking lot of a gas station, engine idling, staring through the cracked windshield of his helmet visor at nothing, his jaw locked and his hands tight on the handlebars, fighting the one feeling he hadn't felt in years and had deliberately, methodically, burned down to the ground inside himself so that it could never be used against him again. The feeling of not being able to leave. And somewhere in the apartment above the broken front stoop on Elm Street, a phone was ringing in the empty kitchen. Ringing and finally going silent, and no one was there to answer it. The $10 bill lasted 2 days. Lily made it stretch the way she'd watched her mother stretch things. Buying the store-brand bread, the dented cans on the clearance shelf, the bruised apples that were still good on the inside, even if they looked like they'd lost a fight. She bought a small bag of rice, a tin of beans, a box of crackers, a jar of applesauce for Ben. She walked to the discount grocery 3 blocks over instead of the corner store because the difference in price between those 2 places, she had calculated on her fingers, was about $1.40 on a full basket, and $1.40 was another day. She did not buy anything for herself that wasn't also for Ben. On the second night, she sat at the kitchen table after Ben was asleep and looked at what was left. 11 cents, a third of a bag of rice, half a tin of beans, enough applesauce for 1 more feeding, maybe 2 if she rationed it. She looked at the phone on the wall. It was an old landline, the kind with a cord, because her mother said cell phones were for people who could afford to lose them. The phone still worked. She knew the number for the building super, for the one aunt who lived 40 minutes away by bus and had made it clear without ever saying it plainly that she had her own life and her own problems. For the school Lily hadn't been attending because she didn't know how to explain why she was showing up without lunch money and leaving early to get back to Ben. She did not pick up the phone. She went to bed and lay next to Ben's warmth in the dark and listened to the buildings settle around them and the distant sound of a motorcycle somewhere outside, the low rolling growl of a large engine moving slowly, like someone circling. She told herself it was nothing. On the 3rd morning, there was another bag on the steps outside their building's front door. Not on the bench down the block, not somewhere she would find it by chance, on their steps, which meant he knew where they lived, which meant he had followed them home or had known already, and neither of those things was simple, and Lily stood on the top step in the sharp morning cold and looked at the bag and felt the two things she always felt when she didn't know whether something was safe: the pull toward it and the warning away from it, both equally strong, a rope going in two directions with her in the middle. She took the bag inside. Oatmeal this time, powdered milk, a small block of cheese, two more baby food pouches, apple and sweet potato again, a package of the specific crackers Ben liked, the hexagonal ones with the slight salt on them that he would hold in his whole fist and gnaw with an expression of absolute concentration, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of plain paper folded once, a $20 bill. No note, no name, no explanation. She put the 20 in the same place she'd put the 10, folded into the back of the single book on the kitchen shelf, a water-stained paperback her mother had never finished reading. She stood with her hand on the spine of the book for a long moment, feeling the rigidity of the bill beneath the cover, and thought about what it meant that she'd already given the money a hiding place, that she'd already started planning around it like it was going to keep coming. She thought about the man across the street, the stillness of him, the tattoos, the way his eyes had moved to Ben first. She pulled her hand away from the book and went to make Ben's breakfast. The cold broke slightly on the fourth day, just enough for the ice on the sidewalk to go soft and treacherous in the afternoon, and Lily took Ben out in the wagon for an hour because he was going stir-crazy inside and because she was too, the apartment having shrunk around them in the way enclosed spaces do when they've held too much fear for too long. She walked the same route she'd walked before, Elm to Third to Clement and back, and she told herself she was giving Ben air and not looking for anyone. She didn't see him, but on the way back, at the corner of Elm and Third, a man stepped out of the barber shop. He was not the big man from across the street. He was younger, shorter, wiry in the way of someone who doesn't carry weight, but is made of something denser than it looks. He wore a leather vest over a dark thermal shirt, and his forearms below the pushed-up sleeves were covered in ink that went all the way down to his knuckles. His hair was pulled back, and he had a beard that was more stubble than intention, and he walked with a slight forward lean like he was used to walking into resistance. He stopped when he saw her. Not the way people stop when they're surprised, the way people stop when they've been waiting. "You, Lily?" he said. She tightened her grip on the wagon handle. "Who's asking?" He put his hands up, both of them, palms out and empty. An old gesture, universal, but it meant something particular when it came from a man who looked like he'd never had much use for the gesture before. "Easy. My name's Ricky. I know a guy who's been—" He paused, like he was choosing the word with more care than his face suggested, keeping an eye out. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yeah, you do." He said it without heat. He looked at Ben, who was watching him from the wagon with the open, fearless curiosity of a toddler who doesn't yet know that strangers can be a category. "Kid's cold. You going home?" "We're fine." "I didn't say you weren't." He put his hands down. "Look, I'm not going to stand here and make a thing of it. I just want you to know what's been left on your steps. It's not going to stop. That's all I came to say." He held up one hand again, not the gesture of surrender this time, but something else. Something that said, "I know how this looks and I'm not going to make it worse." Then he turned and walked back inside the barber shop without another word, the glass door swinging shut behind him with a small electronic tone. Lily stood on the sidewalk and looked at the door. Through the glass she could see the inside of the shop. 2 barber chairs, a mirror running the length of one wall, the blue-white light of a television mounted in the corner. 2 men sitting in the waiting chairs who were not waiting for haircuts. They were too still. They were the kind of still she'd already learned once to recognize. One of them was the big man from across the street. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his eyes forward, not looking at her. His jacket was off, hung on the back of the chair, and without it she could see the width of his shoulders and the faded tattoos on both arms, and the particular quality of a man who has learned to make himself take up less space than his body wants to. His jaw was set. He was not going to look at her. He had made that decision, and he was keeping it. She turned and pulled Ben's wagon home, but all the way back she felt it. The weight of eyes that weren't looking, the attention of a man who had trained himself to watch without being seen watching, and the particular way that kind of attention feels different from surveillance. different from threat. The feeling of it sat at the back of her neck like a warm hand, steady and without pressure. And she hated that she noticed the warmth. She hated more that it made her feel less alone. That evening, she put Ben down early and sat by the front window in the dark and watched the street. The barber shop across and half a block down went dark at 8. She watched the men come out, 4 of them, including Ricky and the big man. She watched them collect at the curb where 4 motorcycles were parked in a diagonal line. Big machines, all of them, the kind that make the air vibrate before you hear the sound. She watched them pull on jackets, check phones, exchange words too low and too far to hear. She watched them mount up, one by one. The big man was last. He stood by his bike for a moment and looked down the street toward her building. He couldn't see her. She was back from the window, in the dark, but his eyes stopped at the right building, the right floor, the right window, and stayed there for 3 seconds before he put on his helmet and kicked the engine over. The sound of it moved through the glass and through the wall and into her chest. They rode south. She watched until the taillights were gone. She sat in the dark for a long time after. His name, it turned out, was not difficult to find. Ricky had said the barber shop like it was a place she should know. And in a neighborhood like this one, a business run by men who rode large motorcycles and had a particular way of standing did not go unremarked. Lily asked Mrs. Okafor the next morning under the guise of asking about the neighborhood generally, who ran what, who to know. And Mrs. Okafor, who missed nothing in a 3-block radius, told her what she knew about the Iron Shepherd MC. "They've been on Clement Street since before you were born," Mrs. Okafor said, stirring her tea. She said it the way people say things about weather. Not good, not bad, just a fact of climate. Mostly veterans, the old ones. Keep to themselves mostly. Don't bother regular people. A pause. "The big one. The older one with the gray. His name is Duke. Duke Lawson. I don't know his story, only that he's been here a long time, and he's not a man who bothers people." Lily sat with her hands around a mug of tea Mrs. Okafor had given her. She'd finally opened the door all the way this morning, perhaps reassured by the simple fact of daily survival, by the proof that Lily was managing, and turned the name over in her mind. Duke Lawson. She said it quietly enough that Mrs. Okafor went on talking about something else. The name had a weight to it, the kind of name that sounds like it was earned, not given. She went home and found another bag on the steps. This time, she didn't take it inside immediately. She sat on the cold top step with the bag beside her and Ben on her lap and waited, watching the street. 15 minutes. 20. The cold worked its way through her coat and through her jeans and into the bones of her knees, and she didn't move. Nothing. No one. Just the street and the thin sound of wind and the distant permanent murmur of the city. She picked up the bag and went inside. The afternoon of the 5th day brought trouble from a direction she hadn't considered. She'd taken Ben to the small pocket park on Linden. Just 20 minutes of fresh air, the sandbox frozen solid, but still a change of scenery. When 3 teenagers came in from the other entrance. They were 16, maybe 17, the kind of age where boys become something unpredictable, where the desire to establish dominance hasn't yet been channeled anywhere useful. They move the way that age moves in packs, loose and loud, taking up space deliberately. They saw the wagon first. "Yo, what's in the bag, little girl?" She had the paper bag from the morning in the back of the wagon because she hadn't taken it inside yet. She had a moment to calculate. They were bigger than her. There were 3 of them. The park was empty. And she put herself between them and the wagon without making a production of it, just stepped back until her legs were against the metal side. "Nothing. Leave us alone." "Nothing." The tallest one repeated it with a grin that meant he was performing for the other 2. He stepped forward and reached past her and grabbed the bag before she could move. Ben made a sound of protest. He didn't understand what was happening, but he understood disruption, understood threat, and his lower lip started to go and Lily's vision went sharp and narrow, and she said, very quietly, "Give it back." "Or what?" Not even a question, a formality. "Hey!" The voice came from behind them, and it was not loud. It didn't need to be loud. It had the quality of a sound that ends conversations, the kind of register that lands somewhere below hearing and above instinct. All 3 of them turned. Ricky was standing at the park entrance. He had not been there 30 seconds ago. He had materialized the way men who know how to move quietly sometimes materialize, without ceremony, just present, with his thumbs in the front pockets of his jeans and his eyes moving across the three boys with an expression that was almost bored, and the almost was doing a lot of work. "Drop it," he said. The boy with the bag looked at Ricky, looked at the tattoos on his forearms, looked at the way he was standing, made a rapid and accurate calculation, and dropped the bag. They left the way boys leave when they're pretending they weren't scared, fast but sideways, reclaiming dignity with the angle of their departure, and then they were through the other entrance and gone. Ricky picked up the bag, walked to the wagon, set it down without looking at her. He crouched to Ben's height and looked at the baby for a moment with an expression that was not the expression he used for anything else, something open behind the performance of toughness, something that might have been the shape of a memory. "He okay?" he said. "He's fine," Lily said. Then, before she could decide not to, "How did you know we were here?" Ricky stood up, looked at her directly. "We don't let things go unnoticed, not in this neighborhood." A pause. "Not this specific part of this neighborhood. You've been watching us. Duke's been watching you." He said it simply, without apology. "I've been watching the guys who watch you." She stared at him. "Why?" He looked away, up the street toward nothing specific, the way men look when they're deciding what to say and what to leave inside where it stays safe. "Because he asked me to," he said finally, "and because he doesn't ask for much, so when he does, it means something." He looked back at her. The almost bored expression was gone, and underneath it was something she wasn't prepared for. Something tired and honest and old. The expression of someone who has spent a long time doing hard things in the dark and has learned to accept that no one is going to understand why. And because there are things a man pays back in this life, whether the person he's paying back can receive it or not. He walked to the park entrance and stopped with his hand on the iron gate. "Duke wants to meet you," he said. "Not to scare you, not to make any kind of deal. He wants to... Look, I don't know how to say what he wants because he didn't say it out loud. He doesn't say much out loud, but I know him, and I know the difference between the times he's acting and the times he's not, and this is the second kind." He pushed the gate open. "Barbershop. Tomorrow morning. You don't have to come." He left. Lily stood in the frozen park with Ben in the wagon and the paper bag retrieved and the sound of the gate swinging shut behind Ricky, and she understood that she was being given a choice. A real one. The kind where both options have weight and neither one is obviously right. She went home and did not sleep much. At 9 the next morning, she put Ben in the wagon and walked to Clement Street. The barbershop was open but not yet busy. The electronic tones sounded when she pushed the door, and the warmth inside hit her like something physical. The kind of warmth that reveals how cold you've been, that makes the cold outside suddenly real by contrast. It smelled of shaving soap and hair product, and underneath both, coffee, strong and old, the kind kept warm on a burner for hours. Duke Lawson was in the barber's chair nearest the window, but not getting a haircut. He was sitting sideways with his feet on the floor and a mug in both hands, and he looked at her when she came in with an expression that was exactly nothing, a face that had learned to show nothing as a first posture which Lily understood from the inside. Ricky was behind the counter. Another man she didn't know was near the back, young, big-armed, with a shaved head and the particular alertness of someone on permanent watch, and he looked at her once and then looked at a spot on the wall, which was his way of removing himself from the situation. "Close the door," Duke said. "It's cold." She closed the door. She stood inside it with the wagon handle in one hand and looked at him. He was older than she'd thought from across the street. Mid-40s, maybe pushing into late. His face was weathered, in the way of someone who has spent a lot of time outside in all seasons, deep lines at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that had stopped being soft sometime in his 20s and had never gone back. There was a scar along his left jawline, not fresh, silvered with age, the kind of mark that has a story behind it that nobody tells at dinner. His hands around the mug were large and scarred at the knuckles and steady. He was not nervous. She couldn't tell if he was ever nervous. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." He He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Then he made the smallest movement of his head, not quite a nod, more an acknowledgement. Okay, she stands, and looked down at his coffee. Ben, from the wagon, said "bah," which was his all-purpose sound for people and was not a word yet. Duke looked at him. Something moved in his face. It was not large, and it was not long, and if she hadn't been watching for exactly that, if she hadn't already learned that men like this show things in small measurements, she would have missed it entirely. But she was watching, and she saw it, and she filed it away. "How long has she been gone?" he said. "Who?" He looked at her. She held it for 3 seconds. "I don't know who you're talking about." "Okay." He took a drink of his coffee, set the mug down, looked at the window. "There's a restaurant supply place 2 blocks over. They throw out food every Thursday morning. Good food, packaged stuff, past the sell date by 1 day. I know where the dumpster is, and I know when the guy empties it, and if you're there first, you can get what you need." A pause. "I'm just telling you that." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it's useful." "Why do you care if it's useful to me?" He was quiet for a long moment. The barber shop hummed around them. The refrigerator unit behind the counter, the low television in the corner with the volume turned most of the way down, a car moving past on the street outside, and the brief Doppler shift of its radio. "I knew someone once," he said, "a long time ago, when I was in a bad place." He paused, not for effect, for the actual work of choosing words. Someone who didn't have to stop. But he stopped. He gave me what I needed, and he didn't ask for anything back, and then he walked away. And I've been trying to work out what that kind of thing costs a person, and what it's worth for a long time. He picked up his mug. "I'm not going to get sentimental about it." "Good," she said. "I don't like sentimental." Something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. The first thing that had moved in that direction. "Yeah," he said. "I noticed." She stayed for 40 minutes. She didn't sit down until Ben got restless enough to need lifting out of the wagon, and she sat in the empty barber chair next to Duke's and held Ben on her lap and didn't talk much. But the silence between them was not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who have both learned that talking costs something, and so you spend it carefully. When she left, Duke said, "Tomorrow morning, same time, if you need anything." She said, "I don't need anything." He said, "Okay." She came back the next morning. The days built a structure around that. Mornings at the barber shop, brief, never planned in advance, always with the pretense of passing through rather than arriving. Duke was always there. Sometimes Ricky, sometimes 2 or 3 others whose names she learned slowly. Marcus, who was 40 and had been Army. She could tell without being told by the way he moved and the way he listened. Turn, who was younger and laughed easily and played with Ben on the floor with a ring of keys like it was the most natural thing, like he'd done it before. They were not what she'd expected. They were not what anyone expected, she was beginning to understand, and the gap between what people expected and what they were was something each of them carried differently. Duke carried it like armor. Like the outside reputation was a thing he'd built deliberately, stone by stone, because the alternative, being legible, being knowable, was a risk he couldn't afford. On the 8th day, he asked about her mother. Not directly. He said, "You're managing a lot," which was not a question, but had a question in it. Lily looked at Ben, who was on the floor with Turn's keys. "I'm fine." "When did she leave?" A long pause. Outside, a truck passed, air brakes hissing. 9 days ago, she said. He was quiet. It's not like she left us," Lily said, and heard the defense in her own voice and hated it. "She has problems. She gets overwhelmed. She always comes back." "Has she done this before?" Longer pause. "Once, when I was 5. "How long was she gone that time?" She looked at the wall. 3 weeks. He didn't say anything. He didn't say 3 weeks back to her in that tone people use when they want to show you what something sounds like from the outside. He didn't look at her with the particular pity that is its own form of damage. He picked up his coffee and looked at Ben on the floor and was quiet in a way that made space rather than pressing into it. That was the day she understood that Duke Lawson was, whatever else he was, a person who knew the weight of things without needing to narrate it. And that was also the day that everything changed. It started with a car. A white sedan, 2 years past clean, with a dented front quarter panel and a county seal on the door. It parked outside Lily's building at 2 p.m. On the 8th day while she was inside, Ben napping, the apartment gone quiet in the thin afternoon light. She saw it from the window and felt the old knowledge move through her, the animal recognition of a category of vehicle she'd been afraid of since she was 5 years old. A woman got out, late 30s or worn into the middle of them, with a dark coat and a bag over one shoulder, and the careful blank expression of someone trained to reveal nothing until they've assessed the room. She looked up at the building. Lily stepped back from the window. The knock came 3 minutes later. 2 official raps, the kind that announce authority before the voice does. Lily stood in the kitchen. She looked at Ben's closed bedroom door. She looked at the front door. She looked at the phone on the wall. She opened the door. The woman said, "Are you Lily Harper?" She had a badge holder open in one hand, the county seal in laminate, a photograph of a face that looked more rested than the current version. "My name is Sandra Reeves. I'm a child services. I know what you are," Lily said. Sandra Reeves looked at her, really looked, the practiced assessment of a woman who had stood in 1,000 doorways and was very good at reading what she found there. She looked at Lily's coat, still on because the apartment was cold. She looked at the clean state of the kitchen, visible behind Lily, the managed scarcity of it, the careful arrangement of not much. She looked at the dark under Lily's eyes. "Is your mother home?" she said. Lily held the door. Her grip on the edge of it was tight. She went out. "She'll be back." When did she go out? The space between them filled up with everything Lily wasn't saying. Sandra Reeves had heard 1,000 versions of that silence. "Lily," she said, and her voice did something careful with the name. "I need to know if you and your brother are safe. Can I come in and we can just talk? I'm not supposed to let strangers in." "I understand. That's actually—" A pause. "A good rule." She kept her voice level, without any of the mechanical kindness that Lily remembered from the last time. Whatever else this woman was, she was not performing. "I'm going to leave my card. You can call me if you need anything. My cell number is on the back." She held out the card. "I'll be checking back." Lily took the card. The woman looked at her for one more moment with something in her eyes that was more complicated than a clipboard. Then she walked back down the stairs. Lily closed the door. She stood in the kitchen holding the card and listening to the silence of the apartment and the sound of her own breathing and the distant sound of Ben asleep and the car starting outside. The specific sound of county authority pulling away from the curb, and she knew, with the clarity of a person who has spent too many years reading situations fast, that this was not a visit that ended at the door. This was the beginning of a process, a machine that, once started, followed its own sequence. She had 48 hours, maybe less, before it came back in a different configuration. She picked up the phone and called the barbershop number that Ricky had written on a receipt and pressed into her hand 2 days ago with a look that said for emergencies. It rang twice. Duke picked up. "She was here," Lily said. "County, Child Services." Her voice was steady. She'd made it steady. I don't know what to do." The silence on his end lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. "I'm coming," he said. "No, you don't have to." "I'm coming," he said again, and the repetition was not aggression, was not dismissal of her protest, was simply the statement of a fact that had already been decided before she'd had the chance to undecide it. "Get Ben ready. Don't open the door for anyone else." The line went quiet, and she stood with the dead phone in her hand and felt, for the first time in 10 days, the particular vertigo of not being the only one deciding things. She stood there for a long moment, and then from somewhere in the building, from below, from the street, carried through the walls and the floor and the glass in the way sound carries in winter when the air has a certain quality to it, she heard the low rolling approach of a motorcycle engine, followed by a second, a third. The sound of them came up through the sole of her boots and through the bones of her legs and settled somewhere in her chest, not like a threat, but like a frequency she hadn't known she was waiting for. And outside the window, the street was still and gray, and the White County sedan was gone. And in its place, pulling slowly to the curb in a line, were 3 motorcycles with their engines dropping to idle. And the men on them were not looking up at her window, were not performing presence, were simply there. Lily looked at the card in her hand. Sandra Reeves, Department of Child and Family Services, and a phone number with the county exchange, and on the back in blue ink the cell number, and below that, in handwriting that looked like someone who writes quickly and means what they write, call anytime. I mean that. She turned the card over, then over again. And from the bedroom, Ben woke up and called for her, his small voice traveling down the hall with the clarity of the only voice she'd ever rearranged her whole life around, and she put the card in her pocket and went to get him. And somewhere below in the cold gray afternoon, Duke Lawson was coming off his bike on Elm Street, and there was a thing happening here, a convergence, an arrival at the edge of something that Lily could feel the shape of without being able to name it yet. But she could name what it wasn't. It wasn't the end. It was the moment, she understood with the sudden and absolute clarity of a child who has been paying attention to the edges of things her whole life. When you find out what everyone around you is actually made of. And somewhere in a county office 20 minutes away, Sandra Reeves was sitting at a desk and opening a file with Duke Lawson's name on it, and reading what was inside, and whatever she expected to find there, whatever the leather jacket and the tattoos and the motorcycle had prepared her to find. She had stopped on the 3rd page and gone very still, the way a person goes still when the story they were telling themselves collides with a different story that turns out to be more true. She read it again. She reached for her phone. Sandra Reeves read the file 3 times. Not because it was long. The active case summary was 4 pages, the supplementary record 11, and she was a fast reader. Had to be. In a job where the backlog never went to 0 and reading slowly was a luxury that children paid for. She read it 3 times because the first time through she didn't believe it, and the second time through she was looking for the place where it would stop being true. And the 3rd time through she accepted it and sat very still in her chair in the county office with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead and the sound of her colleague on the phone 2 desks over and the particular feeling of a file that rearranges everything you thought you were walking into. Duke Lawson. Age 46. Honorable discharge, Marines. After 11 years of service that included 2 tours she couldn't read the details of because they were in sections that had been bureaucratically grayed out. The kind of redaction that means the details are not classified exactly, but are the kind of details that institutions prefer to keep inside their own walls. No criminal record. 1 arrest 17 years ago, dismissed. The arresting officer's notes described a bar fight in which Duke Lawson had, according to 3 witnesses, intervened to stop 2 men from assaulting a woman and had in the process broken one man's nose and the other man's collarbone, and the charges had been dropped before they saw a courtroom. The arresting officer had written in the margin of his own report, in handwriting Sandra recognized as the kind people use when they want something on record without putting it in the official record. Wrong guy in the box. She turned to the supplementary pages. This was where it stopped looking like the file she'd expected. Rent payment records, not his own, records obtained through a community organization's outreach archive, the kind of records that existed only because someone had thought to keep them, showing 17 separate instances over 9 years in which an anonymous donor had covered the rent of families in the Elm Street corridor who were about to be evicted. The organization's coordinator had noted, in a memo attached to the file, that the donor had asked specifically not to be named, had paid in cash through a third party, and had said when asked why, because I know what it feels like when nobody does. 3 pages of attestations from a veterans outreach program in which Duke Lawson was named 7 times as a person who had provided informal housing, meals, and employment referrals to veterans returning from deployment with no support structure. Not as a volunteer, not as a program employee, as an individual who showed up repeatedly without being asked. A letter from a father. Michael Donahue. She skimmed the religious affiliation and focused on the content, describing a period 8 years ago in which Duke Lawson had spent 4 months helping rebuild a community food pantry after a fire, doing the physical labor himself and recruiting 6 other men to help. and had declined to be mentioned in the community newsletter afterward. And at the back, behind all of it, a single photograph. Not an official document. Someone had slipped it in. She couldn't tell who. The file had passed through 4 offices before reaching her desk. A photograph printed on regular paper. The ink slightly blurred at the edges the way inkjet photos go when someone prints them in a hurry. It showed Duke Lawson outside what appeared to be the Clement Street barbershop, maybe 5 years ago. His hair a little darker, the lines in his face a little less. He was crouched down on the sidewalk. In front of him was a small boy, maybe 3 years old, in a winter coat too big for him, and the boy was crying, and Duke's large scarred hand was on the boy's back, and whatever he was saying to the boy had made the crying stop. You could see that in the photograph. You could see the shift mid-cry, the open mouth beginning to close, the body beginning to settle. And the expression on Duke's face was the expression of a man who has forgotten, for a moment, to make his face say nothing. Sandra Reeves looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called a number in the file. She called the Iron Shepherd MC's registered community liaison. Yes, they had one, which had itself surprised her. And the number rang 4 times and went to a voicemail with a message. In a voice that was young and slightly impatient, and she left her name and number and said she needed to speak with Duke Lawson as soon as possible. Her phone rang back in 6 minutes. It was not the young, impatient voice. It was Duke, and his voice on the phone was the same as she imagined it in the file. Level, not warm, but not cold, precise in the way of someone who chose words carefully because he had learned at some point that words were not reversible. "Miss Reeves," he said. "Mr. Lawson, I appreciate you calling back quickly." "What do you need?" She looked at the photograph. "I need to understand your relationship with Lily Harper and her brother." A pause. Not the pause of a man with something to hide. The pause of a man who is deciding how much truth to give and in what order. "She's a child in my neighborhood," he said. "She needed help." "How long have you known the family?" "I didn't know the family. I saw her on the street." Another pause. "I knew her father." Sandra's pen stopped moving. "James Harper." "Yes." "He's been deceased for 3 years," Duke said. "I know." She let the silence hold for a moment. "How did you know him?" The pause this time was longer. When he spoke again, his voice had not changed in volume or in tone, but something underneath it had shifted, something load-bearing that she could hear the adjustment of without being able to name what it was. "He helped me once," he said, "a long time ago, when I had nothing. A beat. I owed him something I could never pay back. So I'm paying it forward to his kids." Sandra Reeves sat with her phone against her ear and the photograph on her desk and felt the specific sensation of a narrative turning inside out, the story she'd walked in with. Biker, tattoos, children, concern, becoming a completely different story that used all the same elements. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "I need to visit with Lily and Ben today. I'd like you to be there." Another silence. "I don't know if that's a good idea," he said. "She's spooked. He stopped. "She trusts me about halfway. If you show up and I'm there, she might think I set her up." "I'll manage that," Sandra said. "I need someone she knows in the room." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "Okay," he said. "Give me an hour." She gave him 40 minutes. She pulled up outside the Elm Street building at 3:40 in the afternoon, and Duke's motorcycle was already at the curb, and the man himself was on the front steps, jacket on, not looking at the street but at the building, like he'd been having a conversation with it. He looked at her car when she got out. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything immediately. He was bigger than she'd anticipated. Not the file size, which was just numbers, but the physical presence of him on those steps, the way he occupied space, not aggressively, not for effect, but as simply as a large tree occupies a spot. He had his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he looked at her with eyes that were doing the same thing she suspected her own eyes were doing, rapid assessment, searching for the category. "Ms. Reeves," he said. "Mr. Lawson." She stopped at the base of the steps. I read your file. Figured you had. It was not what I expected. Something moved behind his eyes. It never is. She climbed the steps. He didn't move to open the door for her, which she registered not as rudeness but as a deliberate neutrality, a choice not to perform anything. She opened it herself. He followed. They were 3 steps into the stairwell when the door to the second floor opened above them, and Lily was there, at the top of the first flight, with Ben on her hip and the wagon handle in her other hand that she was holding for something to hold. And she looked at Sandra first with the controlled wariness Lily had shown at the door, and then she looked at Duke and something complicated crossed her face. Not betrayal, not yet, but the shadow of it, the shape of the thought forming. You brought her, she said. She called me, Duke said, not the other way. Lily looked between them. Her jaw was tight. You gave her my address. She already had it, Lily. Then why are you here? He looked at her steadily. Because you called me and I said I was coming, so I'm here. The simplicity of that landed somewhere. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was doing a lot of interior work, and then she looked at Sandra, and Sandra kept her face neutral and open and did not speak, because she had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do in a doorway moment like this one was fill the silence with the wrong thing. Fine, Lily said. Come up. The apartment was as Sandra had partly seen through the door that morning, clean in the way that reveals effort, the kind of clean that doesn't come from having enough but from caring in the absence of enough. The kitchen counter was clear. The floor was swept. There was a drawing taped to the refrigerator that Ben had apparently produced, a collection of shapes and marks in crayon that Lily had signed with his name in careful block letters at the bottom, like it was a real piece of art, which Sandra thought, privately, it was. Lily put Ben down with his blocks and sat at the kitchen table, and Sandra sat across from her, and Duke stood against the wall near the door the way men stand when they've decided to be present, but not intrusive. Sandra put her bag on the floor and took out a notepad, but left it closed on the table. And Lily looked at the notepad and then at Sandra's face. How long has your mother been gone? Sandra said. She'll be back. I know you believe that. How long? Lily's hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, like she was reading the surface by touch. 10 days. Sandra wrote nothing. Has she called? The phone... Lily paused. Something shifted. The phone rang once, a few days ago. No one answered in time. Do you know where she might have gone? She does this. It's not... The defense rising again, the same one from the doorway. And it was not a lie, Sandra understood. It was both a defense and a true thing. She always comes back. I understand. Sandra meant it. She'd sat at 100 kitchen tables, and she knew the difference between a child covering for a bad situation and a child trying to explain a complicated one. This was the second kind. I'm not here to take you away from your home. I want you to understand that first. Lily said nothing, but her hands on the table flattened a little more, like something released a fraction of tension. I'm here because someone in the building called our office. Sandra watched Lily's face. Do you know who might have called? Mr. Petrakis, Lily said immediately. He saw me leave with the wagon. There was no anger in how she said it, just information. She'd already figured this out. He didn't open the door when I knocked, but he saw me from the window. He called, and he watched from the window. A pause. That's how this works. Sandra looked at her for a moment. How old are you? 8? You know a lot about how this works. It happened before. Lily's eyes were steady. When I was 5. I know what it looks like. Sandra left a silence. Then, Lily, if your mother doesn't come back within the next few days, I need to have a plan for you and Ben. That doesn't mean I take you anywhere. It means I need to know you're safe. Do you understand the difference? I'm keeping him safe. I can see that. She said it plainly, not as praise, but as the factual statement it was. You're doing it well, but you're 8 and he's 1, and you can't do this alone indefinitely, and my job is to make sure you don't have to. She paused. Is there anyone? Family? A neighbor you trust? Lily's eyes moved involuntarily to Duke against the wall. Duke looked at the floor. Sandra looked between them and understood something she hadn't brought into the room with her. "Mr. Lawson," she said. He looked up. "What is your relationship to these children, in your own words?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, careful. "Neighbor," he said, "someone trying to help. Do you have any interest in providing temporary support while we locate their mother? Housing, meals, supervision, formal arrangement with the county's involvement?" The room went very still. Lily was looking at Duke with an expression Sandra couldn't fully read, something between wanting and not allowing herself to want, the specific face of a child who has learned that hope has a cost. Duke looked at Sandra. "What does that look like?" "Paperwork. Background check, which, given your file, won't be a problem." She let that land. His eyes moved slightly, a micro-expression of surprise he controlled quickly. "Regular check-ins from my office. Temporary. Until we locate her mother, or until a family member can be identified." He was quiet for 3 long seconds. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Lily made no sound, but Sandra, watching her, saw the thing that happened in the small muscles around her eyes. Something going out, some voltage that had been running continuously for 10 days and had just, for 1 second, found a ground. That was 4 p.m. By 6 p.m., the world had turned. It started with Ricky, which was where most things started and ended in Duke's orbit. He came through the barbershop's back door at 6:15 with a look on his face that Sandra, who was still there finishing paperwork at the counter, had not seen before and did not want to see again. The look of a man who has been handed information he can't carry gracefully, the kind that changes the shape of the next several hours. Duke looked up from the coffee he was making. He read Ricky's face. His own face did nothing, but his hand stopped moving. "Outside," Ricky said. Duke looked at Sandra. She was putting papers in her bag and had clearly heard the door and Ricky's voice and was doing the polite fiction of focusing on her bag. He looked at Lily, who was on the floor with Ben and the stuffed bear, and was not doing any fiction. She was watching Ricky with the full attention of a child who had long ago learned that the moment when adults changed their tone was the moment to pay closest attention. 5 minutes, Duke said to Ricky. They went out the back. The alley behind Clement Street was narrow and cold and smelled of the restaurant 3 doors down and the dumpsters along the opposite wall, and the single overhead bulb above the barbershop's back door had been burned out for 2 weeks and Duke had not replaced it, which meant they stood in the dimness between that burned-out bulb and the light bleeding from the restaurant's exhaust vent 20 feet away, and Ricky's face in that light looked worse than it had inside. "Talk," Duke said. "We found her," Ricky said. Duke said nothing, but the stillness of him changed quality. "She's at St. Mary's Emergency, has been for 4 days. She went in the same night she left the kids." Ricky reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it, but didn't hand it over yet, like he was making sure Duke was ready for what came after. "She's stable now. She was in bad shape when they brought her in." "What kind of bad shape?" Ricky looked at him. "Overdose, Duke." The alley held the words. A truck moved on the street beyond the building, and the sound of it was very far away. "The kids," Duke said. "She didn't call anyone. Not for herself and not for them. She went in unconscious, and she's been... The hospital said she was not in a position to make calls until yesterday, and yesterday she made 1 call." Ricky paused. "She called her aunt, Lily's aunt, the one on the other side of the city." Duke waited. "The aunt called Child Services," Ricky said, "not to report concern. Duke," the aunt called to initiate a custody filing. The light from the restaurant vent hummed. Something in the kitchen clanged against something metal, a brief percussion in the cold. "She wants the kids," Duke said. "She wants the benefits," Ricky said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of someone saying an ugly thing accurately. Marcus looked into it. The aunt has 3 prior CPS flags. Nothing that's stuck, but Marcus says the picture isn't good. She's been through 2 husbands and she's behind on everything, and there's a man in the house whose name keeps coming up in the wrong context. He finally handed over the piece of paper. That's what Marcus pulled. Informally. It's not official. Duke unfolded the paper and read it in the insufficient light with the particular efficient focus of a man who has learned to read under bad conditions. His face during this was as close to nothing as it ever got, which was the thing that Ricky had always found more unsettling than anger. Duke's nothing face was not absence. It was a very great deal of something being very tightly held. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket. "Sandra Reeves," he said. "She's still inside?" "Think so." He went back in. Sandra was at the counter, and Lily was on the floor, and Ben had fallen asleep against the stuffed bear, and the shop had the specific quiet of a late evening with a sleeping baby in it, the quality of air in a room where someone small is resting. Duke sat down in the barber chair near Sandra's counter and looked at her and said, "Her mother's at St. Mary's." Sandra's pen stopped. "She went in the night she left. Overdose." He said it straightforwardly, no embellishment, no softening, but also without the clinical remove of the deliberately unaffected. "She's stable. She's been stable since yesterday." From the floor, without looking up, Lily said, "I heard you." The room paused. Duke looked at her. She was sitting with her knees to her chest and her arms around them, and her face was turned away toward the wall, and her back was absolutely rigid. "Lily," Sandra started. "I heard," Lily said again, and her voice was the voice of someone holding something very heavy with both hands and refusing to put it down. Sandra stood. She moved toward Lily carefully, the way you move toward something that might startle. She sat on the floor, not beside Lily, but near her, at a distance that offered presence without pressure. Duke did not move from the chair, but he watched her back, the rigidity of it, the held-together quality of it, with the expression he had been trying since the beginning not to let her see, the one that lived beneath the nothing face and was not nothing at all. Lily turned. Her eyes were dry. She was not crying, and she was not going to cry, not here, and Sandra recognized this too. The child who has used up the crying privately and arrived at the public part already spent. But her face was the face underneath the management, raw and young and very, very tired. "She's okay?" she said. "She's okay," Duke said. "She's going to be okay." Lily looked at him for a long moment. Something passed across her face that was not one thing. It was several things at once, relief and fury and grief, and the specific bitterness of having been right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about, all of it moving through her features like weather. "She's always okay," Lily said quietly. "And then she's not, and then she's okay again." She looked at Ben asleep on the floor. "And we're the ones who—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Never mind." "You don't have to never mind," Sandra said softly. "Yes, I do." Lily stood up. She went to Ben and picked him up with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times, the transfer from floor to shoulder in one smooth motion, and Ben didn't wake but made a small sound and settled, and she stood with him and looked at Sandra and Duke in turn. "What happens now?" "That's what we're going to figure out," Sandra said. "Together, okay?" Lily looked at the word together like it was an object she was deciding whether to pick up. Duke's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His jaw tightened incrementally, something only visible if you had been watching his jaw long enough to know its baseline. "I have to make a call," he said. He said it to Sandra, but he was looking at Lily when he said it, and his look was not apologetic but was something adjacent, an acknowledgement that the timing was bad, and he knew it, and he was leaving anyway because the call required it. He went to the back. Ricky was still in the alley. Duke pushed the door open and stood in the frame, the light from inside making a long rectangle on the alley floor. "The aunt filed this afternoon," Ricky said. "Marcus just confirmed. It's in motion." Duke looked at the burned-out bulb above the door. "She knows the kids exist now," Ricky said. "She didn't know before because the mom didn't tell her, but someone at the hospital, a nurse, they think, someone called the aunt when the mom came in. The aunt's been sitting on this for 4 days deciding what to do." A pause. "She decided. Does she know where the kids are?" "Not yet, but Sandra Reeves's visit will be on record by morning." Duke looked at the alley. He looked at the dumpsters, and the restaurant light, and the strip of dark sky above the buildings, and the burned-out bulb, and the rectangle of warm light on the cold ground. "The man in the house," he said, "the one whose name comes up in the wrong context." Ricky was quiet for a moment. Yeah. How wrong? Ricky looked at him directly. Wrong enough that I don't want to say it out loud in an alley, Duke. The two men looked at each other in the insufficient light, and the thing that passed between them was not a conversation because it didn't need to be. They had known each other for 11 years, and they had been in enough rooms and enough alleys and enough situations where the unsayable thing needed to be understood without being said. And this was one of those times, and Duke understood it, and the quality of his stillness changed again in the way Ricky had learned meant something was being decided at a level below words. How fast can Marcus get documentation? Duke said. On what? Everything, the flags, the man, whatever's attached to her history that Sandra Reeves needs to see before she processes a custody filing. Ricky pulled out his phone. By morning. Tonight, Duke said. Ricky looked at him. Duke? Tonight, Ricky. Ricky nodded once and made the call, turning slightly away, and Duke stood in the back doorway and looked at the alley and at the burned-out bulb and at the rectangle of warm light on the cold ground where Lily was on the other side of the door with her brother on her shoulder and an expression that was doing 11 days of surviving in silence. He went back inside. Sandra was on the phone, standing by the counter with her back half turned, her voice low and official in the way of someone who has shifted back into the institutional register. Lily was in the barber chair nearest the window, not his chair, the other one, with Ben asleep on her lap and both her arms around him and her face turned to the glass in the dark street outside, the orange streetlights and the still cars and the empty sidewalk. Duke sat in his chair. He did not speak. He looked at his hands. After a minute, Lily said, without turning from the window, "What aren't you telling me?" He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, her mother's jaw probably, the dark of her eyes against the streetlight. The 8-year-old who had walked through 10 days of winter on 65 cents and a safety pin and a piece of cardboard in her left boot and had gotten here, to this chair with her brother breathing on her lap, and the question in her voice was not a child's question. It was the question of someone who had learned that the pause before the answer was the answer. There are things in motion, he said carefully, that I'm working to deal with. About my mom? Related to your mom, yes. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. Her eyes in the barbershop light were very dark and very steady. Tell me. He held her gaze, and something shifted in him. The calculation, the protective withholding that was its own form of care, and shifted back because he had spent a long time underestimating this child, and he was not going to do it again. Your mother has family, he said, a relative who may try to take you and Ben. Lily's face did something rapid and complex that ended in stillness. My aunt. You know about her. My mom talked about her sometimes. Lily's voice was careful. Not good things. No, he said. Not good things. She looked down at Ben asleep on her lap, at the bear jammed in the crook of his elbow, at the hat with the bare ears slightly askew. She looked at these things with an expression that was the most frightened she had looked in 11 days, which was saying something because she had not let herself look frightened much at all. She's not taking him, Lily said, quietly. Absolutely. No, Duke said. She's not. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. I can't. Not yet. Lily looked at him. The word yet sat between them and did its work. From the counter, Sandra's phone call ended. She turned around. She looked between Duke and Lily with the assessment of someone who had walked back into a room and found it different than she left it. What did I miss? She said. Duke looked at her. You're about to get a package of documents, he said. Tonight, from a source I trust, about Lily's aunt. Sandra's face went through something. How are you getting documents about... I'm not going to answer that question, Duke said, but I am going to ask you to read them before you process any filing from her office. Can you do that? Sandra looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Lily. She looked at Ben asleep on Lily's lap with the one-eyed bear. She picked up her pen. What's the aunt's full name? Duke told her. She wrote it down and her face said nothing, but her pen moved like she meant it. Outside, the first rain of the evening had started without anyone noticing. A fine, cold rain that made the streetlights on Elm bloom outward into soft halos, and turned the sidewalk to a dark mirror and ran in thin channels along the curb. Duke noticed it when he heard it against the barbershop window, a sound like static from a radio between stations, low and continuous and without pattern. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it. A number he didn't recognize, local area code, and he almost didn't answer, and then something that was not quite instinct and not quite reason made him pick up. "Lawson," he said. A pause. And then a voice he had not heard in 3 years. A voice he had, in the years since he'd last heard it, heard only in the specific auditory memory that comes at 3 a.m. when the walls are insufficient, said his name. "Duke!" He went completely still. The voice was thin. Hospital thin? The particular compression of a person talking through weakness, through whatever combination of medication and recovery and something else that had no medical name, through 3 years of a life that had clearly arrived somewhere no one had intended. "It's Claire," the voice said. I know I have no right to..." A breath that caught. "Duke, they're going to take my kids. My sister is going to take my kids, and I need you to... I don't know why I'm calling you. You knew James. You knew him, and he trusted you, and I have nobody..." Duke's hand tightened on the phone. In the chair across the room, Lily had gone perfectly still. She had not heard the words, but she had seen his face, and his face, for the first time in the 11 days she had known him, had done something involuntary. Something that didn't belong to the nothing face or the controlled face or any of the faces she'd catalogued. Something that came from much further down than any of those. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew. In the way she knew the cold through the left boot, in the way she knew the creak of the third floorboard, in the way she knew all the things survival had taught her to know without being told, that whatever was on the other end of that phone had just changed the shape of everything. Duke turned slightly away from the room. His voice when he spoke was very low and very level and stripped of everything except the functional minimum, the voice of a man who has learned that you can hold a very great deal together if you use the right tone. "I know," he said into the phone. "I already know, and I'm already working on it." A pause. "Claire, listen to me. Don't call anyone else tonight. Not your sister. Not anyone she's connected to. Do you understand?" The voice on the other end said something that was partly yes and partly crying. "Okay," Duke said. "Okay. I'll be there in the morning." He ended the call. He stood with his back to the room for 3 seconds, which was all he allowed himself, and then he turned around. Lily was watching him with her full attention and Ben asleep on her lap, and the rain on the window behind her making that low static sound, and the barbershop light overhead going slightly yellow at the edges, the way fluorescent lights do when they've been on for hours. "That was your mother," he said. It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was something he had no adequate word for. Not relief, not anger, not grief. Not the thing that comes after grief. All of them. None of them. The face of someone for whom the story has just shifted its entire weight onto a different foot, and the ground underneath that foot is not yet known to be solid. "Is she okay?" Lily said. "She's going to be okay. You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." Lily looked at him. Then she looked down at Ben, then back at Duke, and her voice when she spoke again was very quiet and had nothing performative in it, no armor, no management, just the question underneath all the other questions she'd been not asking for 11 days. "Are we going to be okay?" Duke looked at her. At the 8-year-old in the barber chair with her brother on her lap, and the rain on the window, and the borrowed warmth of a barber shop that was not her home, and the 11 days of winter and the lines around her eyes that were too young to have lines. He had made a lot of promises in his life. He had broken most of the ones that mattered and kept the ones that didn't, and he had spent a long time learning the difference between the promises you could afford to make and the ones you couldn't, and he was very careful about which category he put words into. He looked at Lily Harper and he said, "Yes." And somewhere in the building's old heating system, the furnace kicked on with a groan and a tick and a long exhalation of warm air through the vents, and the rain kept falling on Elm Street, and in a hospital 20 minutes away, Claire Harper was sitting in a bed she'd woken up in 4 days ago and didn't yet know what was coming or what had already been set in motion to meet it, and in a house on the other side of the city, a woman named Diane was making a phone call she thought was private and was not. And the documents arrived at 11:47 p.m. Marcus delivered them in person, not by phone, not by email, in person, because Marcus had learned 11 years ago in a forward operating base outside Kandahar that there were categories of information that only moved safely by hand. He came through the barbershop's back door with a manila envelope that was thick enough to mean something, and he set it on the counter in front of Duke without ceremony and stood back with his arms crossed and his face set in the particular configuration it went to, when he had seen something that required the face to do more work than usual to stay neutral. Duke opened the envelope. Sandra Reeves had stayed. She was on the phone in the corner with her supervisor, her voice low and official, the conversation running long in the way conversations run when the situation has moved past the standard framework and is requiring improvisation at levels the supervisor was not initially prepared for. She kept glancing at the envelope. Duke read standing up at the counter in the overhead light. He read the way he'd read in the field, fast, hierarchically, scanning for the load-bearing facts and building the structure around them. 3 pages in, he stopped. He went back 2 pages. He read a section again. He set the papers down flat on the counter with both hands and stood with his palms on the surface and looked at the wall behind the mirror. Duke, Marcus's voice was quiet. I see it. There's more. Page 7. He turned to page 7. The man in Diane's house, the name Ricky had not wanted to say out loud in the alley, had 2 priors that had not resulted in convictions for reasons that were documented in the file with the particular clinical language that legal systems use to describe failures of their own machinery. There was a restraining order, dissolved. A child protective investigation, closed without findings. The notes from the investigating caseworker included the phrase child recanted under unclear circumstances, which was its own language for a thing that everyone in the room understood without saying. There was a 3rd document, not from the county system, but from a neighboring county, a school incident report involving a child in the home. And what the incident report described was enough that the school counselor had flagged it, and the flag had been sent forward, and had then, somewhere in the machinery, been filed into a place where nothing moved. Duke closed the file. He looked at Sandra Reeves across the room. She was still on the phone. She met his eyes and read something in them and said to her supervisor, I need to call you back, and ended the call. She walked to the counter. He turned the file to face her. She read. He watched her read. Her face did the work that it needed to do to stay professional, and he could see the effort that required, the controlled quality of her expression, while the eyes moved across the page and what was in the eyes was not controlled at all. She got to page 7. She stopped reading. She looked up at Duke. Where did this come from? She said. Does it matter? Legally, Sandra. He waited until she was fully looking at him and not at the question. Those children cannot go to that house. You know what's in that file and you know what it means, and I need you to tell me what you can do tonight before a custody filing processes in the morning to make sure they don't. She looked at the file. She looked at Ben asleep in the chair where Lily had transferred him, the stuffed bear under his arm, his small chest moving with the uncomplicated rhythm of a sleeping child who doesn't yet know what's being decided around him. I can flag the filing, she said. Tonight. Put a hold on it pending investigation of the secondary home environment. She said it precisely, finding the procedural frame that made it actionable. That gives us 72 hours before it moves again. What do you need to make that stick past 72 hours? An alternative placement that I can document as stable and appropriate. She looked at him. Formal, not informal. The county needs a name on paper, a background check on file, an address that passes a home visit. The room was very quiet. My address, Duke said. Sandra looked at him for a long time. Your background check is already in your file. It's clean. Another pause. Your home. I haven't seen your home. I'll make it appropriate. Duke. She said his name in the way people say names when they're making sure the person understands the weight of what they're agreeing to. This isn't a favor. This is a legal arrangement. There are visits, check-ins, court appearances potentially. If the aunt contests it, let her contest it. It could get Sandra. His voice was level, without heat, without performance. I know what it could get. Tell me what you need. She picked up her pen. At 12:30 a.m., Lily woke from where she'd fallen asleep in the barber chair and found the barbershop different than when she'd closed her eyes. Marcus at the counter, Ricky standing near the back wall, a third man she didn't know stationed at the front window with his eyes on the street. Duke at the table with Sandra, papers between them, both of them with the focused, depleted look of people who have been working through something for hours. She sat up. She checked Ben immediately, the automatic maternal gesture, hand to his chest, rising and falling. Okay. She looked at Duke. What time is it? She said. Late, he said. Go back to sleep. What's happening? He looked at her across the room. We're handling it. She looked at Ricky, at Marcus, at the man by the window. She looked at the papers on the table and the pen in Sandra's hand and the expression on Duke's face that was the nothing face working at maximum capacity over something that was very definitely not nothing. You're all here, she said, in the middle of the night. Yeah, Ricky said. Simple. She looked at him. Why? He looked back at her with the tired, direct honesty of a man who is past the point in the night where performing is worth the energy. Because Duke asked us to be here, he said, and because the situation requires it, and because he stopped. The expression that had crossed his face in the park, the open thing behind the toughness, moved through again. Because we don't let things go wrong when we can stop them going wrong. That's it. That's all it is. Lily looked at the men in the room. At the late hour, and the rain still on the windows, and the papers on the table, and the sleeping baby, and the whole architecture of what had been built around her in the days since she'd sat on a bench in the cold and felt someone watching. She lay back down in the chair. She put one hand on Ben's back. She closed her eyes. It was not sleep that came, but something close enough. At 2 a.m., Duke's phone rang with the number he didn't recognize, the same one from earlier, and this time he stepped outside to take it. The rain had softened to a mist that hung in the air like cold smoke, and Clement Street was empty in the 2 a.m. way, the orange streetlights making columns in the mist, and the sidewalk wet and dark and reflective. It was not Claire this time. The voice on the other end was male, middle-aged, carrying the particular vocal quality of a man who was accustomed to being the largest presence in a room and was not used to having that challenged. It said Duke's name without a question mark, already an assertion. You don't know me, the voice said. My name is Gary. I'm with Diane. Duke said nothing. I understand there are some documents going around, Gary said. About my history. I want you to understand that those documents are going to look very different once my lawyer gets involved. And I want you to understand that whatever arrangement you think you're building for those children, it's going to come apart the same way it went together. Fast. A pause designed. And you don't want to be standing next to it when it does. Duke stood in the mist on Clement Street. He could hear the faint sound of a television from an apartment above, the distant bass frequency of the city never fully going to sleep. Okay, he said. Okay, the voice repeated, surprised by the monosyllable. That's all you've got. That's all I need right now, Duke said. I've got everything else already. He ended the call. He stood for a moment in the mist. Then he went back inside and found Ricky watching him from the counter. Gary called, Duke said. Ricky went still. He has your number. Now he does. Duke set his phone on the counter. He's already moving. He wouldn't call unless he knew we were ahead of him, and he was trying to rattle something loose. He looked at Marcus. Where's the filing right now? Sandra put the hold on at midnight, Marcus said. It's in the system. Can he reach the system? Marcus and Sandra exchanged a look. He can reach a lawyer at 2 a.m. if he's got money, Sandra said. A lawyer can file a motion by 8 a.m. The hold gives us until... How solid is the hold? As solid as I could make it. Her voice was even. But if he has a lawyer with the right connections in the county system, they can argue procedural irregularity in how the alternative placement was processed. We moved fast, and fast leaves gaps. She looked at Duke. I need the home visit done before 8 a.m. I need it documented and in the system before he can file. Duke looked at the clock above the mirror. 2:07 a.m. "How fast can you do a home visit?" he said. "Now," she said. "We do it now." The Iron Shepherd MC's clubhouse was on Deering Avenue, which was 11 minutes from Clement Street in no traffic, which at 2 a.m. was all the traffic there was. Duke rode in front, Sandra's county sedan behind him, the headlight of his bike cutting the mist ahead in a long white cone. He didn't think about what she was going to see when she got there. He thought about the layout of it, the walkthrough he'd do to show her what she needed, the bathroom and the kitchen and the rooms, and the particular quality of a place that was not decorated for a home visit at 2 a.m., but was what it was. The clubhouse had been a mechanic's garage in its previous life and still looked like it from the outside. A broad, low building with a rolling metal door on one side and a regular door beside it, and 2 security lights that came on when the bikes and the sedan pulled into the lot. Inside it was different. Not luxurious, not designed, but lived in the way of a place where people had actually been living and the living had left its marks. A kitchen with a real stove and a long table that seated 12, a common room with couches that had seen years and survived them. 3 rooms off the back hallway that were for members who needed somewhere to be, a bathroom that was clean, a second bathroom that was also clean because Marcus's standard for cleanliness was military, and he'd applied it here the same way he applied it everywhere. Sandra walked through without speaking. Duke walked behind her and did not narrate. He had learned that narrating a space to someone assessing it was a form of argument, and argument created resistance, and what he wanted from her was direct perception. So he let her look. She stopped in the doorway of the third back room. It was the one that had a window facing the small yard behind the building, and the bed was made with flat, tightened corners, the way Duke had been taught to make a bed 20 years ago and had never unlearned. There was a dresser. The window had curtains that had been there when they'd moved in, plain white, doing their job. It was not a child's room, but it was a room. She looked at it for a long time. "There's a second room," Duke said, "smaller, at the end of the hall." She turned and looked at the end of the hall. She walked to the smaller room. It had a single window and a narrow bed and a built-in shelf along one wall. It was the smallest room in the building, but it had the most light, even now, at 2 a.m., the security lights from the lot making the curtains glow. Sandra stood in the doorway and looked. "It would need some things," Duke said, "for the kids. Age appropriate. I can have it done by morning." "It's 2 a.m. "I know." She looked at him over her shoulder. The expression on her face was something she was not managing to keep entirely official, some human thing bleeding through the professional surface, and she looked away before she had to account for it. "I'm going to document this," she said, "and I'm going to file it at 6 a.m. when the county system opens. And that is going to be the fastest home visit I have ever conducted, and it's going to have the lightest documentation I have ever produced, and I need you to understand that every corner we cut tonight is a corner that someone can find." "I know," he said, "and you're willing—" "Sandra." She stopped. "Do you need anything else from this room?" he said, "or can we get to work?" She took out her phone and photographed the room in 3 shots. "I need a crib or something appropriate for a 14-month-old. I'll get one." "At 2 a.m. "I know people who are awake at 2 a.m., he said. "That's the only advantage of the life." Something moved in her face that was close to a smile and decided not to complete. She put her phone away. "Okay," she said. "I'll be back at 5:30 to complete the visit. Have it ready." She drove away. Duke stood in the lot and watched her taillights disappear and then turned back to the building. Ricky was behind him. He didn't know when Ricky had arrived. Ricky moved in and out of situations with the fluid, unannounced quality of water finding a level. "Crib," Duke said. "Already texting Turn," Ricky said. "He's got his sister's old one." "Turn's awake." "Turn is always awake. It's a problem." He looked at his phone. "Responding now. He'll be here in 20. Duke looked at the building. He looked at what needed to happen in the next 3 hours and built it as a sequence. The way you built a route, the way you planned a day that needed to cover more ground than it technically had hours for. "I need Marcus on the county filing system at 6 a.m. sharp, he said. "The moment it opens. Making sure Sandra's documentation is the first thing in. Done. I need someone at St. Mary's when visiting hours open, not me. Someone Claire doesn't know, but who can make sure Gary's people don't reach her before I do. I'll send Calloway. Calloway hasn't met her. That's why I'm sending Calloway. He doesn't carry any of this. Ricky looked at him. She needs a clean face right now, someone with no history in the room. Duke looked at him. Yeah, okay. They went inside and worked. Turn arrived at 2:34 with the crib in the back of a pickup, folded and bungeed, and he and Ricky assembled it in the small room at the end of the hall with the efficiency of men who were not going to waste time reading instructions. Duke found bedding. He had more than he needed. The MC maintained a supply of linens for a reason he'd never examined too closely. The reflex of men who knew that people sometimes arrived with nothing and needed something. He made the crib with the same flat-cornered discipline he made everything and stood back and looked at it in the small room. Turn stood beside him. He was the youngest of them by a decade, 26, and he had a child of his own somewhere in a situation that was unresolved in a way he didn't talk about. And he stood looking at the crib with the expression of someone for whom cribs were not abstract. It's good, Turn said quietly. It'll do, Duke said. At 3:15 his phone buzzed with a message from a number he recognized as one of Marcus's secondaries, the one used for information that needed to move without a name attached. Gary retained Philip Holst, filed emergency motion 3:08 a.m., hearing 9 a.m., Judge Carver. Duke read it twice. Philip Holst was a family law attorney whose reputation in this county was for two things: getting results and not being concerned about the methods. Duke knew the name the way you know names that have come up in enough conversations, that have been in enough rooms where things were decided, that carry their own gravity in the local legal atmosphere. Holst was not corrupt, which would have been easier. He was simply very good and very motivated by winning, which was worse. And Judge Carver was 70% Holst's wins on emergency motions. Duke put his phone in his pocket and went to find Marcus. Marcus was at the table in the common room with his laptop open and two phones in front of him and a coffee that had gone cold beside them, his reading glasses on, which was the only vanity Marcus possessed and the one he would deny if asked. He looked up when Duke came in and read the message without being shown it. I know, Marcus said. I got it at the same time. Holst. Yeah. Marcus took his glasses off. That changes the legal geography. What do we have? The file. Sandra's documentation. Your background check. The home visit by 6. He ticked them off without the ritual of counting on fingers, just the list of what existed. Against Holst filing an emergency motion with a judge who likes him, arguing procedural irregularity in the placement and grandmother, aunt's, primary claim as blood relative. He looked at Duke. Blood counts in family court, even messy blood. What about the file on Gary? Inadmissible in its current form, the way it was obtained. I'm not asking about admissible. I'm asking about what happens when Sandra walks into that courtroom with it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. She'd be taking a professional risk. I know, that's her decision. He paused. What else do we have? The school report, that one's official record. It's in the county system independently. Marcus tapped something on the keyboard. I found it. It's there. If someone with standing requests it. Sandra has standing. Sandra has standing. They looked at each other across the table in the 3 a.m. common room with the cold coffee and the two phones and the crib assembled down the hall, and the sound of the rain that hadn't entirely stopped, just changed character, now a low irregular percussion on the metal roll door. She's going to take the risk, Duke said. It was not a question. She already took it at midnight when she put the hold on, Marcus said. I think she decided something when she read page 7. Duke sat down. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for 3 seconds, which was all he allowed. Then he took his hands away and looked at the table. I need to be in that courtroom at 9 a.m., he said. You can't represent yourself in a... I don't need to represent myself. I need to be there when Sandra represents the situation. He paused. And I need someone who can speak to my character if it goes to that. Someone who isn't me and isn't the club. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Father Donahue wrote you that letter, he said carefully. I know he did. He'd show up. I know he would. Duke looked at the table. Who else? Mrs. Okafor, Ricky said from the doorway where he'd appeared without either of them registering it. She's been in that building 20 years. She knows the kids. She knows you. He held up his phone. I texted her at 2 a.m. like a reasonable person. She responded immediately, which tells you everything you need to know about Mrs. Okafor. Duke looked at him. She said yes, Ricky said, before I even asked what for. Something happened in Duke's face. Not the smile, not its cousin. Something further in than either of those. Something that moved briefly in the region of his eyes and was gone. Okay, he said. There's one more thing, Marcus said. Duke looked at him. Marcus turned the laptop to face him. On the screen was an email, the county system header at the top, addressed to Sandra Reeves's work account, sent at 2:58 a.m. from an address Duke didn't recognize. He read it. He read it again. He looked up from the screen at Marcus, and Marcus looked back at him with an expression that had moved past analysis into something more fundamental. The email was from the nursing staff supervisor at St. Mary's Hospital. It was not addressed to Sandra. It had been forwarded to Sandra by someone in the county intake office, who apparently had better instincts than their job description required. It described a conversation that had taken place between Diane, the aunt, and Claire Harper's attending physician. A conversation in which Diane had represented herself as Claire's primary next of kin and medical decision-making authority and had requested information about Claire's prognosis and likely discharge timeline. That part was within the scope of what family members did. The next part was not. Diane had asked the attending physician what the realistic probability was that Claire would be able to regain custody of her children within the next 6 months. And the attending physician had said, in the careful, hedged language of medical professionals who are always aware of liability, that it was unlikely given the severity of the episode and the treatment requirements. And Diane had said to this physician, in this room, with a nurse present who had written it down exactly, then we don't need to rush her recovery. The nurse had written it down because she hadn't been sure what it meant, and things you're not sure of, you write down. Her supervisor, reading it later, had understood what it meant and had sent the email. Duke closed the laptop. The rain on the roll door was steady. Somewhere outside on Deering Avenue, a car passed with its radio running, a brief pulse of sound, and then nothing. That's not a threat, Ricky said quietly. Legally. A lawyer would say it's ambiguous. I know what it is, Duke said. Duke, I know what it is. His voice was level. So level, it had no level to go down to. She's not going to slow walk her sister's recovery because it inconveniences her timeline. She's not going to do that. He stood up. Because she's not going to have a timeline. Ricky looked at him. What are you thinking? Duke picked up his jacket. I'm going to the hospital. It's 3:30 in the morning. I know. Visiting hours? I'm not visiting. He checked his phone, put it in his pocket. I'm going to sit in the parking lot until 6 a.m., and I'm going to make sure nobody gets to Claire Harper before I do. And at 6 a.m., I'm going to walk into that hospital, and I'm going to sit in a chair in her room, and I'm going to be there when she wakes up. And then I'm going to tell her what is happening and what we're doing about it and ask her what she needs. Because she is James Harper's wife, and James Harper's children are in a crib at the end of my hallway, and there is a man named Gary who has just made the mistake of making this personal. The common room was very quiet. Outside, the rain decided to become something more serious, harder and more direct. The kind of rain that strips the remaining mist and hits the metal door with a sound like a decision being made. Ricky put on his jacket. I'm coming, he said. You don't have to, I'm coming, Duke. He said it the same way Duke had said I'm coming to Lily on the phone. The same flat declarative, the repetition that was not argument but fact. Marcus, you're on the filing at 6, turns on the building, Calloway's on Claire's room from outside until Duke gets in. Anything else? Marcus put his glasses back on. I'll have the school report request drafted and in Sandra's hands at 5. She can file it herself at 6:01. He looked at Duke over the glasses. Go. Duke and Ricky went through the back door into the rain. The motorcycles were in the lot, wet and dark, the chrome going flat in the rain, and Duke swung onto his and felt the familiar weight of it, The particular gravity of the machine under him that was the one physical thing in his life that had never asked him to be anything other than what he was. He kicked it over. The engine turned and caught and settled into its low, chest-level idle, and beside him Ricky started the same way, and the two of them sat for a moment in the rain in the lot on Deering Avenue with the engines running and the rain coming straight down and the night around them doing what nights do at 3:30 a.m. in late winter, refusing to give any indication that morning is coming, even though it always does. Duke pulled out of the lot. The hospital was 20 minutes in the rain at legal speeds, which was not how he was traveling, and the streets were empty and the lights were green more than not, and the rain on his helmet made a sound like static from a radio between stations, and he thought about a photograph in a file that had ended up on the right desk at the right time, and a letter from a man who wrote things down because he understood that things written down have a different kind of permanence, and a child asleep in a barber chair with her hand on her baby brother's back. And he thought about James Harper, who had crouched in front of a different man in a different winter and had said words that Duke no longer remembered exactly, but had spent 17 years trying to live up to. The hospital appeared ahead, its lights the particular blue-white of institutions that never sleep. And he pulled into the visitor lot and cut the engine, and the rain came straight down on him and on the bike, and on the lot, and on the building. Where somewhere on the third floor, a woman was sleeping. The shallow sleep of the medically recovering and did not know what was coming for her at 9 a.m. What was coming for her at 9 a.m. was a lawyer named Holst and a woman named Diane, and 17 years of a system that moved slowly enough that by the time it arrived where it was going, half the damage was already done. And what was also coming from this parking lot, from a barbershop on Clement Street, from a county office where Sandra Reeves was awake, with a file in her hands and a decision already made, from a small room at the end of a hallway where a crib had been assembled in the dark by men who were better at this than they looked. What was also coming was something else. Duke sat on his bike in the rain and looked at the hospital entrance and did not move because moving was not the job right now. Waiting was the job. Holding the ground was the job. And that, of all the things he'd ever been asked to do, was the one he was best at. Beside him, Ricky pulled in and cut his engine and sat in the rain without complaint and without conversation because he understood this too. They sat. The rain came down. At 4:48 a.m., a black SUV with no plates pulled slowly into the far end of the visitor lot and parked with its engine running and its lights off, and Duke, who had not stopped watching the lot for 90 minutes, saw it immediately, and his hands on the handlebars went from still to very still, which was the difference between resting and the SUV sat with its engine running for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Duke counted them. Not on a clock. In the particular internal rhythm that develops in men who have spent enough time in the dark waiting for things to happen, the rhythm that is not patience but its operational cousin, the deliberate conversion of tension into fuel rather than noise. On the 4th minute, the driver's door opened. Gary was not what Duke had constructed from the voice on the phone. The voice had suggested bulk, the specific weight of a man who had spent years being the largest thing in the room. In person he was medium height, medium build, wearing a jacket that cost more than its owner, with a face that had learned to lead with confidence so early in life that the confidence had become structural, had replaced the underlying architecture rather than augmenting it. He was 40, maybe 42, and he moved across the wet parking lot toward the hospital entrance with the assurance of a man who believed that most situations responded to the right amount of forward momentum. He was 10 feet from the entrance when Duke stepped in front of it. Gary stopped. He looked at Duke. He looked at Ricky, who had materialized to Duke's left with his hands in his jacket pockets, not threatening, just present, the way a second fact is present in an argument. He looked back at Duke, and something happened in his face, a rapid recalculation, the confident structure doing load-bearing work it wasn't designed for. "Lawson," he said. "You can't go in there," Duke said. "It's a hospital. I have every right. At 4 a.m.? To a patient who hasn't consented to your visit, in a situation where a county flag has been filed on your household." But Duke's voice was the same voice it had been all night, level, without heat, stripped to function. You walk through that door, the night nurse calls security, security calls the county line, and by 6 a.m. there's a violation notice attached to the custody filing before it ever reaches Holst's hands. You know that. He paused one beat. Or your lawyer told you that and you came anyway. Gary looked at him for a moment. The recalculation was still running. You don't know what you're involved in. I know exactly what I'm involved in. Those kids are family. Diane is their blood. Blood's a fact, Duke said, not an argument. Gary's jaw tightened. The confidence structure was doing its best. You're a biker. You run a club out of a garage. You think a judge is going to look at you and look at Diane and see, I think a judge is going to look at a school incident report from Millbrook County, Duke said, and a restraining order, and a CPS flag with the phrase child recanted under unclear circumstances. And then I think the judge is going to look at you. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. And then I think we'll see what a judge sees. The rain came down between them, straight and cold. Gary stood in it. Something went through his face that was not the confidence structure, something older and rawer, the face behind the face, and what it showed was not malice, but something almost worse, the expression of a man who had told himself a particular story about who he was for so long that the story had stopped requiring evidence, and he was only now, in a hospital parking lot at 4 a.m. in the rain, feeling the story begin to require it again. He looked at Duke for a long moment. Then he walked back to the SUV. He got in. The engine was still running. He sat there for 2 minutes. Duke and Ricky stood in the rain and let him sit. And then the lights came on, and the SUV backed out and turned south toward the exit and was gone. Ricky exhaled slowly beside Duke. Not relief. Ricky did not do relief exactly, but the calibrated release of a man letting go of something he'd been holding ready. That's not over, Ricky said. No, Duke said, but it's 5 a.m. and he's gone and Sandra files at 6, and Holst is going to have a different morning than Gary paid for. He looked at the entrance. Go home. Get an hour. What about you? Duke looked at the hospital doors, at the blue-white light of the lobby beyond the glass. I'm going to go sit with someone, he said. Ricky looked at him, nodded once, got on his bike and rode south into the rain, the sound of the engine trailing away until the night absorbed it. Duke went inside. The night nurse at the third-floor station was a woman of 50-something who had the particular unruffleable quality of someone who had worked the overnight shift long enough to have seen every variation of human need arrive at her desk. She looked at Duke, the jacket, the tattoos visible at his collar, the rain still on his shoulders. And he looked back at her and said quietly, Claire Harper, I'm not going to wake her. I just need to be in the room. She looked at him for a long moment. You're the one who called yesterday, she said. It was not a question. Yes. She looked at his hands, at the rain on his jacket, at whatever it is that people see when they've spent years reading the difference between threat and need. 20 minutes, she said, then visiting hours. He sat in the chair beside Claire Harper's bed in the dark, in the quiet of a hospital room at 5 a.m. The only light, the soft blue of the monitoring equipment, and the gray pre-dawn beginning at the window. And he looked at the woman in the bed who was James Harper's wife and Lily Harper's mother, and the person whose absence had set 11 days of winter in motion. She was 41. She looked older in the way that some kinds of difficulty age a face, not in the features themselves, but in some quality of the skin, the particular translucence of someone who has been through something metabolically expensive. Her dark hair was loose on the pillow, and her hands were folded on the blanket with the slightly formal arrangement of a sleeping person who is not deeply asleep, and her breathing was the slow, medicated, healing rhythm of someone whose body is doing the serious background work of repair. Duke did not wake her. He sat in the chair and looked at the window and the gray light coming, and he thought about James Harper, which he did not do often because doing it cost something he'd learned to budget carefully. He thought about a parking lot, 17 years ago, outside a bar he no longer remembered the name of, when he'd been 30 years old and already 3 years out of the service and still had not figured out what to do with what he'd brought back. And James Harper had been a stranger who had stopped because Duke was sitting on a curb at 2 a.m. with his back against a wall and a look on his face that meant something specific to a man who recognized it. James had sat down beside him, on the curb, like it was a normal place to sit. He hadn't asked what was wrong. He'd said, "You eat today?" Duke had said no. James had handed him a sandwich from a bag he was carrying, had sat there while Duke ate it, had talked about nothing in particular, a game he'd watched, a street repair on Elm that was taking too long, his daughter who was 5, and had recently decided that the correct response to every question was because. He talked the way people talk when they're giving someone the gift of normal, when they understand that what the other person needs is not to be seen in their worst state, but to be treated as though the worst state is temporary, which it is, though it never feels that way from inside it. When Duke had finished the sandwich, James had pressed 2 folded 20s into his hand. Duke had tried to refuse. James had said, "I'm not giving it to you to be nice. I'm giving it to you because you look like someone who's going to make it, and I want to see what you do." He'd stood up, collected his bag, and walked home to the apartment on Elm Street where his wife was and his daughter was asleep in her room. Duke had never seen him again. He'd heard 3 years ago that James Harper had died, cardiac, sudden, 45 years old, the kind of death that has no warning and no argument. Duke had found the apartment on Elm Street and stood outside it for 10 minutes and then walked away, because there was nothing to do with that kind of loss that could be done from the sidewalk. Until 11 days ago, when a girl with her father's jaw had sat on a bench in the cold with a red wagon and 65 cents and the look of someone who was going to make it. And Duke Lawson, sitting in a hospital chair at 5:07 a.m., with the gray light coming through the window, understood with the quiet finality of something arriving at its own conclusion that he had not wandered into this. He had been walking toward it 1 degree at a time for 17 years. Claire Harper opened her eyes at 5:23 a.m. She saw him and went still with the particular quality of someone who doesn't know if they're still in the sedated semi-consciousness where things appear that aren't there. "You're real," she said. Her voice was rough. "Yeah," he said. "Duke Lawson." She looked at him. "James talked about you." "He talked about me." "He said he'd done something once that he hoped was the right thing." She took a slow breath. "He said there was a man he'd sat with on a curb one night, and he never knew if it had made a difference." Duke looked at his hands. "It made a difference." She closed her eyes briefly. "My kids. They're safe. Both of them. Ben's sleeping right now in a room on Deering Avenue with a crib that turned put together at 2 a.m. And he's fine." A pause. "Lily is—" He stopped, looked for the right word and found only the accurate one. "She's incredible." Claire's face did something that was not crying but was in the same terrain. "She's 8. I know," he said. "She didn't act like it. She never does." The words carried 17 layers of things, pride and guilt and grief and love, in the particular combination that only parents arrive at, that specific weight. "She's been doing this since she was 5, taking care of everything. She shouldn't have to—" Her voice went thin. "She shouldn't have to take care of everything." "She doesn't have to anymore," Duke said. "Not right now. Right now someone else is taking care of things." She looked at him. Her eyes were dark, like her daughter's, and had the same quality of measuring what they saw. "For how long?" He looked at her directly. "For as long as it takes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the gray had lightened to something approaching actual morning, the first suggestion of a day arriving, and in the hospital the sounds of the early shift beginning, carts in the hallway, voices at the distant nurse's station, the building beginning to move toward its daytime self. "I'm going to do the work," Claire said, "the program. Everything they're asking." Her voice was not asking for his belief. It was informing him of a fact she had already settled with herself in the particular way you settle facts that have been too long unsettled. "I need you to know that." "I know it," he said. "You don't know me." "No, but I know your kids, and I know what they're made of, and they're made of something." He looked at her steadily. "So are you." The courtroom at 9 a.m. was not large. Family court in this county ran in rooms that felt provisional, folding chairs in the gallery, a judge's bench that was functionally a desk, the particular fluorescent light that erased shadows and made everyone look like they hadn't slept, which in this case was accurate. Sandra Reeves had filed at 6:03 a.m. Holst was good. He was exactly as good as advertised, and he made his argument with the smooth economy of a man who knew the terrain. Blood relation, stability, the irregular circumstances of the competing placement, the lack of established prior relationship between the children and the proposed guardian. Duke sat in the gallery and listened, Mrs. Okafor sat beside him in her good coat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting with the composure of a woman who had raised 4 children and outlasted 2 husbands and had no intention of being anything other than exactly what she was. Sandra presented the school incident report. She presented the CPS flags. She presented the medical record from the nursing supervisor. She presented Duke's background check and the community attestations and the photograph that had been in the file, the one of Duke on the sidewalk with the small crying boy, the hand on the back, the moment the crying stopped. She presented her home visit documentation from 5:45 a.m. that morning. Holst objected to 3 things. Judge Carver sustained 1 and overruled 2. Mrs. Okafor was asked to speak, and she spoke for 4 minutes without notes, in the precise, unhurried way of someone who has been telling the truth so long that she no longer needs to organize it in advance. Duke was not asked to speak. The judge reviewed the documentation for 11 minutes in which the room was very quiet. Then she denied the custody filing. She ordered a 90-day temporary guardianship in Duke Lawson's name, with monthly review by Sandra Reeves's office, pending Claire Harper's completion of a residential treatment program and subsequent evaluation. Holst gathered his papers. Gary, in the gallery, sat with his hands flat on his knees and a face that had completed its recalculation and arrived somewhere private with the result. Duke walked out of the courtroom into the hallway, and Mrs. said. Okafor walked beside him and took his arm in the formal, companionable way of a woman who understood that some moments need witnessing, and they walked to the end of the hallway and stood by the window that looked out onto the parking lot and the thin March sunlight that had appeared while they were inside. "Well," Mrs. Okafor said. "Yeah," he said. She patted his arm once and let go. "Coffee," she said. "I know a place." The diner on Clement opened at 6 and had been open since 1987 and smelled of both of those facts. The coffee and the decades, the grease and the particular patina of a room where a lot of people had eaten a lot of meals through a lot of different kinds of mornings. Duke sat in a booth by the window with Mrs. Okafor across from him, and Ricky beside him, and Marcus in turn in the booth behind. And the waitress brought coffee without being asked because she knew Ricky's order, and Ricky's order always involved coffee first. Lily arrived at 8:47, brought by Calloway, who'd driven her from Deering Avenue in his truck with Ben in the car seat Tern had also sourced. Because Tern, it turned out, was the member of the Iron Shepherd MC who was prepared for things involving small children in a way that nobody had ever directly addressed, but everyone had stopped being surprised by. She came through the diner door with Ben on her hip and saw Duke in the booth, and crossed the room with the directness she brought to everything, and slid into the booth beside him, and put Ben on her lap and looked at his face. "We're okay?" she said. "You're okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the table and then at Ben, who had spotted Tern in the booth behind and was reaching toward him with both hands, making the sound he made when he wanted something, the open vowel urgency of a toddler who has not yet learned to wait. Tern leaned over the back of the booth and took him without being asked, and Ben grabbed his nose immediately with both hands, which Tern accepted with the equanimity of someone who had been there before. The diner went on around them. Coffee was refilled. Marcus ordered eggs. Mrs. Okafor told a story about a neighbor from 15 years ago that was not relevant to anything and was very funny, and by the end of it, Ricky was laughing, which was a sound Duke did not hear often enough. And the March sunlight was doing its tentative work on the windows, and the street outside was beginning to fill with the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning, and somewhere on the 3rd floor of St. Mary's, Claire Harper was talking to a counselor and writing something down in a notebook that the counselor had given her, and the something she was writing was a list of reasons. Ben fell asleep on Tern's shoulder at some point between the eggs arriving and the second round of coffee. Lily watched him sleep across the booth with the expression she always had when Ben was asleep, the expression of someone who has been responsible for something precious for so long that the sight of it at rest still registers as something close to wonder, the relief of the standing watch when nothing has gone wrong. Duke watched her watching him. She turned and found him looking. She didn't look away. "My mom," she said. She's really going to be okay. She's going to work for it, he said. That's different from easy, but yeah. Lily looked at the table, at the coffee cup in front of her that was mostly milk because Ricky had made it that way without asking. She said you knew my dad. Yeah? He never mentioned you. We only met once, for about 20 minutes. He looked at the window in the street. He probably didn't think it was a big deal. Was it? Duke was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. It was. She considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to everything, the weight she applied to information that mattered. So this is... She paused. This is because of him. It started because of him, Duke said. It's not about him anymore. She looked at him, the dark eyes that were her father's and her mother's and entirely her own. What's it about now? He looked at her. At the 8-year-old who had walked 11 days of winter on cardboard and a safety pin, who had not cried in front of a single person, who had said, I don't need anything, and come back the next morning anyway. You, he said, and Ben. That's what it's about now. Lily looked at the table. She picked up the coffee cup with both hands the way Ben held his sippy cup. She was quiet for a long time, the diner moving around her, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in a place that had been making the same sound since 1987. Then she set the cup down. Okay, she said. And that was all, just that. The single word that meant she had put something down, some weight she'd been redistributing for 11 days, moving it from hand to hand so neither one gave out, and she had set it down on the table of a diner on Clement Street in the thin March light. And it was still there, the weight. It didn't disappear. It was never going to disappear entirely. But it was on the table now, and she didn't have to hold it alone. Outside, a motorcycle went by on Clement Street, unhurried, the engine settling into the low frequency that lives in the chest before it reaches the ears, and it passed the diner window and kept going, and the sound trailed south toward the city and faded. And the morning kept on doing what mornings do, which is arrive, regardless of what the night was, and make the world available again. Ben slept on Turn's shoulder with his one-eyed bear. Lily drank her coffee. Duke Lawson sat in a booth on Clement Street and did not say anything else because everything had been said that needed saying, and the rest of it, the months ahead, the visits, and the paperwork and the slow work of repair, the rest of it was not something you talked about. It was something you showed up for, day after day, until showing up became the thing you were.